All right, everybody. So today what we're going to talk about are a couple of different things that you may encounter on essay exams regarding psychology, English, history, art appreciation, possibly even geology or geography, things like that. So there are basically three parts to a lot of these tests, depending on the professor. I mean, some prefer to do multiple choice tests, some prefer to do essay tests, some prefer to do identification, short answer, and essay. But what we're going to talk about in this particular video is the essay component. So this should apply whether or not you're working on an essay exam that is standalone, meaning that the entire test is the essay, or whether it's just one portion of the exam. So the first thing that I really want you to focus on is read the question. And I know that sounds silly because, I mean, how are you going to take the test if you don't read the questions? But I mean, really read it, like 2 or 3 times. Really try and understand what the question is asking you to do. So it may be asking you to compare and contrast, say, 2 different psychological theories, or 2 different works by the same author or artists, or by 2 similar authors and artists. It may ask you to discuss 2 different types of, soil or governmental structures, or 2 different periods in history. It doesn't really matter. But at the end of the day, the essay is going to ask you to do something specific. And that's going to inform you as to which type of essay that you really want to look at. So I think I would suggest going back and refreshing yourself with some of the different forms of essays that we've talked about in some of our former videos. Is it a comparison contrast? Is it a narrative? Is it a summary and response, or a summary and analyze? Is it a persuasive essay or an informative essay? So it's really important to try and narrow this down. It'll allow you to answer the question more fully and in a way that really reflects that you understood the professor or instructor's questions. All right, so the second thing is follow standard essay format. And by now, if you've been watching these videos, you should have an understanding of what that means. So you want an introduction, and then 2, you're going to have your body with paragraph A, B, and C that contain your main ideas, the main things you're trying to talk about. And then finally, your conclusion. So this is going to follow that standard 5-paragraph formula. Now, a great way to show that you've been paying attention to the actual essay question is to mimic the question or the word choice of the question in your answer, more specifically in your introduction and conclusion. So if the question asks you to say, I don't know, compare, let's see, George Washington with George W. Bush, then you want to, in your thesis statement for this, which would be at the end of your introduction or the beginning of your conclusion, you would want to say something to the extent of, even though 200 years separated their presidencies, the act of being president remains generally the same, whether you're talking about our first president, George Washington, or our 3rd or 4th, maybe? I can't remember which president George W. Bush was. So use some of the language that they use. If they talk about responsibilities of a president, the election process, how much, it costs to run for president, things like that, then these should be things that you mention. Try and parrot back some of that language. It shows that you're paying attention, and it also uses the same language as the person who made the test, which obviously, they like the way it sounds, so, they're going to look more favorably upon work that kind of sounds like theirs. Also, and this will be a theme across all of the 3 sections that we're going to talk about today, think of buzzwords. And what I mean by buzzwords are, is there terminology? Are there phrases or words or even to an extent groups of people or organizations that throughout the course of the semester you can kind of tell that your professor is fond of? Like, for example, I had a professor when I was taking a teaching course, so I could begin my teaching career at the university level. I had a professor who constantly used the term pedagogy. And pedagogy, I heard the term so much I started to dislike it, not the concept, but the actual word itself. It basically refers to styles of learning. So what pedagogy or what style of teaching leads students to have the most success, so to speak. But because I knew that she loved that term, I made sure not overly so, but I made sure I had a few references to that term, or that I used that term in a few places because I knew she liked that term. I was fine saying teaching methods, but for her, she really liked that term, so I used that term. Same thing with, I'll give you an example, and this isn't, to be seen as politically correct or anything like that, but it's just the way that things are moving. If you have a professor in history who, instead of the term slaves, prefers the term enslaved people or former enslaved people when you're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, then use enslaved people. Don't use the term slaves or free blacks or free African Americans or whatever you want to do. If they use the term enslaved, then mimic them with that. Same thing if you're taking a look, a lot of professors still use the Latin phrase for telling the years. AD, if it happens after year 1, and BC, if it happens before year 1. However, because those have a religious significance, a lot of people have moved to the terminology CE for Common Era, which is what we're in right now. It's the same thing as AD, and BCE, before the Common Era. If your professor uses that, if your instructor uses it, then make sure you mimic that in your own paper. So think about the buzzwords, think about the topics, the phrases, the wording that your professor used over and over and over again during the semester. Try to insert some of that into your own work, as well as affirming some of their theories or their thoughts about things. You may feel differently, and it's okay to express that, but you also may want to agree with the person who is in charge of grading this. I'm not saying don't express yourself. I'm just saying that when you're writing an essay, make sure you're aware of who is grading it. But follow the normal 5-paragraph format, mimic the question, especially in your introduction and conclusion, and think of buzzwords, phrases, terminology that your professor has used and try and include some of that. Most importantly, though, to start off with, make sure you read the question. All right, that's the most important part of beginning this, because if you start off trying to answer the wrong thing, then it's really, really, really hard to get back to what you're looking for. Okay? All right, in the next one, we'll talk about short answer questions, and we'll follow that one up with the definition, or some people call them identification questions. All right, everybody.